everybody. I'm happy to be here today, though. Sorry that Mr. Pastorek, I think is his name, could not be here. There's no mistaking the two of us. I'm sure he's not almost 9 months pregnant. But nonetheless, I'm very happy to be here today. Just a few really brief remarks. In listening to the speakers today, today's topic, it's an important one, but I also think that those of us who are in this room are very fortunate to have the opportunity to be able to consider various school reforms at once, various efforts at once and in broad stroke, and to think about how different things work in different contexts. Of course, we're all thinking about our own context, our own minds, but instead of, as we too often do in the education space, at least in my experience, getting weighed down by the pros and cons and the push and pull of a particular controversial issue, right? We don't usually give ourselves that opportunity. Here in Massachusetts, in the Commonwealth, we've had the opportunity, as we've been discussing, to see many different education reforms in action. As Jim noted, I was editor of a book that looked at the Boston University Chelsea Public Schools partnership, and that was well over 20 years ago. Chelsea, Massachusetts was put into receivership, and Boston University took over the management and day-to-day operations of the district. And in part, due to BU's great commitment to early childhood education, and also I would add to intensive teacher training, Chelsea went from one of the lowest performing districts in the Commonwealth to one of the lowest performing districts in the Commonwealth to one of the highest performing urban districts in Massachusetts. And today, I'm pleased to say we can also point to Lawrence as a success story under the direction of one of our panelists, which I'm very excited to hear more about that. Lawrence was put into receivership in 2011, and I'm sure Jeffrey Riley will correct me if that's incorrect. And the most recent MCAS results show that students in Lawrence have made incredible gains, unprecedented gains in the last year. And of course, I don't have to remind anybody because we've been reminded of not only the great growth that we've seen in Boston Public Schools in recent years, but that we have just phenomenal charter schools. I'm a proud member of a charter school board here, City on a Hill, and we are looking forward to expanding into the community of New Bedford. So at any rate, these reforms, all of these different reforms that we've been discussing today they have the same aim, taken slightly different approaches, but they have a few things in common, some of which have already been pointed out here today. At the center of each are folks willing to stand up to the status quo and say, this just isn't good enough. And they've also, in many cases, as we've heard, put the decision-making power not in the hands of high-level bureaucrats, but back into the hands of those who know schools best, our school leaders, our principals, and parents. Finally, each of these reforms, and we've heard this again and again today, puts children first and the needs of children at the fore instead of the needs of adults. So I'm pleased today that our panel brings a great diversity of experience to the conversation. Many of our panelists have been or are currently at the center of important and large-scale efforts to turn around low-performing schools and districts, and so this promises to be a great conversation, which means I'm going to stop talking. I will briefly introduce each panelist and then ask them to spend some more time introducing themselves. So to my immediate right, we have Kevin Chavous, noted attorney, author, and national school reform leader. From 1993 to 2005, Chavous served on the Council of the District of Columbia, where as Education Committee Chair, he helped to usher charter schools and parental choice into our nation's capital. Next to him, we have Jeffrey Riley, Superintendent and Receiver of the Lawrence Public School District. Prior to taking on this role, Riley served as the Chief Innovation Officer at Boston Public Schools. And Kenneth Campbell, founding board member of the Black Alliance of Educational Options, and has served as the president of the organization since January 2010. Previously, Campbell led Louisiana's charter school efforts as the founding director of charter schools at the Louisiana Department of Education. And last but not least, Mr. Robert Scott, currently a principal at the Texas Star Alliance. He served as the Texas Commissioner of Education from 2007 until 2012 and was confirmed unanimously by the Texas Senate in 2009 and 2011. So I think, actually, Robert, we'll start with you, if you don't mind, some opening remarks.
Sure. As she said, my name is Robert Scott, and I have the best job in the world, and that is former Commissioner of Education. So I can actually come to events like this and tell you what I really think without having to worry about any political repercussions, for the most part. But I've been involved in education policy for the past 23 years at the federal level, working on Capitol Hill as a young man, and all the way up through my time at the agency. When I started to work there, my son was 1 and my daughter was 3 months old, and they're both in college now. So I've been doing this a very long time, and I'm happy to be here. Wonderful to be in Boston. I walked around last night and just really appreciate the treasures that you have in this city. It's truly an amazing opportunity, and I hope to get to do some more of that later today.
Good morning. I'm Kenneth Campbell, president of the Black Alliance for Educational Options, or BAEO, as it's commonly known. And BAEO is an education reform advocacy organization. I would disagree with Mr. Scott just a little bit, because I think I have the best job in the world as president of BAEO, and like him, I'm a recovering bureaucrat. And I like to tell people that without a doubt, I was the worst bureaucrat at the Louisiana Department of Education when I was there, because I spent all day, just about every day, asking either why or why not, and people really couldn't handle that question. So happy to be here. Very disappointed that my beloved New Orleans Saints lost last night. I was here hanging out at a bar with a bunch of Saints fans and a bunch of Patriots fans, and so it was a good time. And at least I'm glad it was a good game, and again, happy to be here.
Good morning, my name is Jeff Riley. I'm the superintendent receiver of the Lawrence Public Schools. I was actually going to open with an apology. I kind of regretted that the Detroit Public Schools weren't here today. And I would apologize to both them and the folks from New Orleans after the wonderful things that happened for the New England Patriots and Boston Red Sox. It's unclear if I have the best job in the world. But I like going to work. We've had some opportunities in Lawrence to get some things done for kids, and it's a little different than I think the traditional setup is. We're actually playing in the space between the charter school world and the traditional union world, which I say is either the sweet spot or the crosshairs, depending on your point of view. And we have had some quality results coming out of the gate. So we're excited to be here. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Kevin Chavous. Again, I'm glad to be here, and I want to thank Jamie and Jim. You guys always run great programs. And I tell you what, I was blown away by Mayor Fenty. I mean, we've known each other a long time. He was, and I just remember as you were talking about what you went through to hire Michelle, and I remember when I hired you, people said, "Why are you hiring that kid? That snot-nosed kid, he doesn't know anything." And you did a terrific job, and I couldn't be more proud of you. You made me think about, the Karate Kid. You snatched the pebble, my brother. So I just really, and I really think that what you and Michelle did was transformative, and I'm very proud of you. And I think that Adrian and I, over the years, came to appreciate the fact that it's one thing to talk about change, it's one thing to, as politicians, to campaign with respect to change. And it's another thing to really embrace this idea of doing all you can to help kids learn. And that's really what I tell people on my way to public service. I found my life's work, my passion, and I look forward to sharing some of my thoughts. I can be a little crazy, as some of you all know. I've been here many times before. But I'm glad that Adrian is going to make me sound a little mild,
Wonderful. Thanks for that. I feel a little strange there being from Detroit and Boston right now. I wasn't rooting for the right team the other night, I suppose. I think we'll start. The first question, Kevin, I'd like to put to you, since you seem quite game. As our speakers have observed, pre-Katrina New Orleans and other cities from Chelsea and Lawrence in Massachusetts to DC and Detroit seem to be examples of a crisis in urban self-government that's compounding school districts' troubles. What are some of the structural problems with urban municipal governments, and how does this impact school reform?
Well, I mean, I think that as we've heard from several folks, including the mayor, politics is front and center oftentimes. And when people say, I think one of the questions was, what's the number one problem? And people will talk about union rules, they can talk about school boards. All that is endemic of the politics of the day that I think is a big barrier to any type of reform. But I think the biggest problem, and Adrian touched on it, is that there really is, and I use this word in this expression in every speech, and Adrian mentioned it several times, really no sense of urgency. I mean, this idea of study the study, plan the plan, debate the debate, has been the biggest barrier to reform. It's the biggest barrier to any systemic change, wholesale systemic change. It is this idea that it's okay that someone else's kids aren't learning. And I think that's, when we talk about challenging the politicians or the power structures or the bureaucracy that rules, we don't challenge them, because for those of us who have access to them, we're okay because we take care of our kids. And the other problem is, I think that in addition to this notion that there's no sense of urgency, why is that? Well, it's because we have let creep in this notion that all kids can't learn. It's okay if those kids over there don't get it, because actually they're doing the best they can. And this, you know, I had a debate with Randy Weingart at Stanford, head of the union, AFT. We had a debate this summer. And she said, well, Kevin, you know, we're trying to find what works. You just don't understand. You talk about choice and all this stuff. But at the end of the day, you know, the problem is poverty. And some of these kids that come to school hungry and all of that, I said, look, I remember reading about slaves learning to read under candlelight. I remember reading about those coal miners in West Virginia after the New Deal got a shot at education, ended up going to college. I remember Cesar Chavez, whose migrant farm workers are working for 20 cents a day, their kids getting the education they need. Don't tell me poor kids can't learn. But the challenge we have is that psychologically there are people who are even ed reformers who believe some kids can't learn. So I think that at the end of the day, we need to divorce ourselves from this notion that it's okay, that there isn't a sense of urgency. The courage will come when we create this national obsession around lifelong learning. When it becomes part of the American DNA that we can't sleep at night if one child is learning. I mean, the Obama administration has probably done as much and more to promote education reform than any administration. But each school day, 7,000 kids drop out. That's over 1.2 million a year. That's over 5 million kids have dropped out of school each school day since Obama got sworn in. And the fact that we're not rushing to the street and spreading tea in a city like this speaks volumes to me. So I think that in my travels, and I've been all over the world visiting schools, talking with school leaders, I always come back to this kid I met in Taiwan, 8-year-old kid, who when I saw him, and Ken's heard me tell the story several times, and I asked the teacher, I said, what? And I always visit schools all over. Tell me about that kid's story, that kid's story. This 8-year-old kid was running around, obviously very bright, very energetic. And I said, you know, can I talk to that kid? Oh yeah, he's the smartest kid in the school. He works harder than anyone else. And I said, why do you work so hard? And I thought there was something lost in translation. I'd heard he spoke English. He couldn't understand why I was asking that question. And he finally said, well, I work hard because it's my duty to my family and my country. And in that environment, beyond that whole, some of you may have read about the Asian mother thing and all that, it wasn't that kind of thing. This kid had in his DNA, it was instilled in him, that he needed to do his part to be as fully educated as possible to help his family and his country. That was in his DNA. And even in places like Cuba, they erect statues to people who go back and get their GED. It's a whole country mindset that embraces this idea of positive lifelong learning. Almost like when Kennedy said we're going to be the first to go to the moon, and the whole nation embraced that. And by the end of the 60s, we were on the moon. It's like women's soccer. We need to create this passion around learning that transcends this notion that it's okay that some kids don't get it. Now, finally, how do you do that? You can't be a little bit pregnant, with all due respect.
You can't.
You really can't. If you're going to embrace this stuff. Because people come to me all the time, because, I started out just pushing for school reform, and Adrian knows it. We work side by side. I don't think you had hair back then, did you?
I really don't like you.
He would fall first. But we started side by side, first talking about DC public school reform. Then the charter bill came. Okay, we're going to promote charter schools. And after the charter schools got there a couple years, we had waiting lists of thousands. Okay, we're still losing kids. DC schools has issues. Let's do the scholarship program. We went on and on and on. And then there are still people fighting us every step of the way. To me, a sense of urgency is you would do anything by any means necessary to help a kid learn. And that means charter school, traditional public school, scholarship, magnet school, special school, home school, virtual school, by any means necessary. I think that with this tendency toward incrementalism and the challenge we have in changing the cultures of school district, we should embrace anything that's going to help a child learn, and that creates an environment where people understand you're serious about reform. Until we get there, I think we're always going to be looking at 10 years from now, we're going to come back and say, wow, how come we can only move the needle so far? Because we've been playing with it instead of being serious about it. And that's why I think the way we need to look at it.
In your current context.
So I mentioned earlier, we're trying to play in a unique space between the traditional union district and what are relatively new charter schools. And I think one of the things we've learned coming out of places like Springfield, for instance, which was in a deeper receivership than just schools recently, is that when you come into something like this, you have to bake in the changes so that after a receivership ends, things don't get rolled back. And so one of the challenges we're working on now is, yes, we've had some positive results coming in. How do we make sure that whenever the receivership ends, whether that's in 3, 5, or 7 years, can we sustain these results and bake them in, and so they can't be undone by the earlier question, which is sometimes the politics of the day. We're looking at it in a slightly different way. How can I best explain this to you? We're in Boston, and I'm Irish, so I'm going to give you an Irish quote by James Joyce. He said, when the soul of a man is born in this country, there are nets flung at it to hold it back from flight. You talk to me of language, nationality, religion. I shall try to fly by those nets. Had he been appointed the receiver of the Lawrence Public Schools, he might have said language, nationality, religion, and the debate between charter and union traditional models. I shall try to fly by those nets, because what I believe is the problem is so big that everyone needs to jump in. I was a principal of a high-performing traditional Boston public school that went from the worst performing in Boston to not just the highest performing, but a place where our children in 8th grade were beating the state average on the math test, and were neck and neck in English, despite 95% poverty, 2/3 second language learners, and 1/3 special education. And so I guess what I'm more focused on right now is this idea of teacher variation. There's an idea in the world that all teachers are alike, and I'm here today to assure you that they are not. There's a professor at Harvard by the name of Elmore. Richard Elmore is a very smart man, and although he talks about some things I don't believe in, one of the things he has great research on is the teacher variation problem. That is, in any school, whether it's the highest performing or the lowest performing, whether it's suburban, private, or whatever, in any school, in one classroom there's a great teacher next to a mediocre teacher next to a terrible teacher. And the best schools, what they do is they take this variation and they shrink it. There's a professor, he was a high school principal, his name's Rick DeFore, and he tells a story about a guy that goes and buys a kind of country inn on a bend in the road, way out in this rural area, and on half of the inn he sets up his taxidermist shop, and on the other half of the inn he sets up his veterinary clinic, and his slogan is, either way you get your dog back. Now Rick wasn't trying to tell us that our children are animals. What Rick was trying to say is that the quality of the person working with our children matters, and that this variation is the key and is the thing that has to be looked at more closely. We spent a lot of time in this country on the stock market. We spent a lot of time in this country on the housing market. Imagine if we as a country said, we've kind of dug our own grave here, and we will put all our energies to the next generation and focus on the education space. And that is bringing the best people into education. Not just the people from the bottom third of college graduating classes, but the best people. Which, by the way, as a side note, is why you see some people fighting over third-year Teach for America people, right? Because they are the people that are going to stay in the classroom, and many of them are these super talented people. And that's why there's a fight among some people, because you want to have the best teachers. My kids go to a traditional Boston public school, which is amazing, and the teacher quality is amazing. That is, I know my kid's going to have a great teacher in 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade, and I'm thrilled with that. And you guys know this because you all went to high school, right? I mean, you know, you may have gone to a great high school and you can still name the 5 miserable teachers. So that's what we're focused on in Lawrence.
Anybody else like to comment on that?
I think the only thing I would add to that is, when we talk about the barriers, I really do think a big one is that, and this is kind of related to what Kevin said, that our belief system in terms of education, I think, is just all wrong. We don't believe that every child can achieve at high levels, and we certainly don't have people who have the will and the kind of courage to go up and do something about it. And it's easy sometimes for us to sit here and say this, and it's easy for us to listen to Mayor Fenty and what he did, but I can tell you it was hard, and there was a price that he pays for that. And at the end of the day, he believes it was well worth it, but there are a lot of people who don't. And I think until we acknowledge that, and just stop sitting in rooms saying, well, all you got to do is this, all we got to do is elect the right person, all we got to do is get some courage, we got to understand this is hard. There is an embedded psychology that is there that's incredibly hard to change. And so I just think we have to find ways to embrace the people who are really ready to do this and find ways to build deep and wide the kind of support systems that they have in order to go about doing this work. Because if we don't do that, you'll have the kind of fits and starts that we have in many places.
Robert, I'm wondering if you could, to sort of piggyback on this question, if you might be able to follow up. In the past, you've talked about the fact that many of the Louisiana students who have stayed in Texas have done quite well. If you could elaborate a little bit onto why you think that is, and if there are certain barriers that those students didn't face in Texas that they had faced prior.
Sure. I think first and foremost, the ability for the state education agencies to work very quickly in accessing the student records. And I credit the State Department of Education in New Orleans. When we got the phone call, that is August 29th, 2005 was when Katrina hit New Orleans, and I got a call from the chief of staff in the governor's office saying, get ready. And I said, what do you mean? She said, you're gonna have a bunch of kids coming in. I said, for how long? She said, we don't know. I said, how many? She said, probably 10 to 20,000. It actually wound up being closer to 50,000. And it was a massive undertaking for our schools to take those kids in. And over the course of the 3 years, in 2005-06, we asked every school district to identify those kids. And they were not just from New Orleans, there were some from Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida as well. And then we matched them to a Texas cohort that looked just like them, both in terms of ethnicity and economic status. And over the course of the next 3 to 4 years, we found that students that were 3 to 4 years behind either caught up or exceeded their Texas cohort in 3 to 4 years. And then the question you asked is why? I don't know that our study comes to any firm conclusion, but I believe that families faced with this incredible crisis and moving into a very new place, I would hope that it caused them to reconsider their priorities. I know that the students who came to school with rolls of toilet paper because their schools in New Orleans didn't have it, and were quickly told, we'll take care of that for you. We're in a different environment, and I think they saw an opportunity, and I think their parents saw an opportunity for success, and I think they took advantage of it. And I think that educators in Texas were able, because we had the records, because we had money for interventions, we were able to take that population of kids, that static population, and allow them to achieve the same or higher as their Texas cohort. And I think that says a lot. And I talk about this a lot. I don't set immigration policy, but I think it's instructive. And that is, if you get a group of children who come in 3 to 4 years behind, given the time and opportunity, you can help those children excel. But if that population replaces itself every year with a brand new 10 to 20%, and you don't have an opportunity to mitigate that in any way, you are always going to have that bottom 10 to 20%, and you'll never be able to fix it.
Thank you. Kenneth, I'd like to throw this next question to you. And so we've seen today from Patrick Wolf and Nirav Kingsland, they've mapped out some very promising data from DC and New Orleans, where significant percentages of students are now in charters and other schools of choice. This is a topic very near and dear to us in Massachusetts right now, the charter school cap. Why aren't more cities going the charter choice route? And what role will school choice play in the future of traditional urban districts? We saw this great data that says, look what could happen here in Boston if only you scaled up your high-performing charter schools.
Yeah, a few things. First of all, I think in America, we value kind of comfort and stability over change. We like to talk about change with stars in our eyes and big smiles and stuff, but in reality, we're really change averse and risk averse. And so having a system that is truly disruptive, that changes entire things, is incredibly hard. And it worked in New Orleans because there was no choice. But at the end of the day, if you go into Boston and you say, okay, we need to shake this whole thing up, there will be a whole lot of people who agree with you on some level, but then to go from that to, we got to make this change, and we know it's going to be chaotic. We know there are going to be disruptions. We know not everything is going to work perfectly, is incredibly hard to do. And so, again, that's one of those, I think, psychological things that we really have to get over. The other one is, I think, when it comes to both New Orleans and DC to a certain extent, whatever progress we're making, I think, is in jeopardy because the opponents are really latching onto those places and trying their best to tear down the results and the progress that we've made. And we allow that to happen in some cases because we're completely losing the kind of messaging war and campaign in terms of what this work is all about. We're out here talking about data and metrics and all these sorts of things, and they're talking about kids and communities and families. We talk about competition, they call us privateers, who are trying to change public education. And so, we go on about our merry way, kind of having these inside conversations with each other as reformers. And I think our opponents are really talking to communities and families and people who are invested in these systems and people who have a great deal of economic fear and a fear of loss of power. And we have to be, I think, more sophisticated and more simplistic in our messaging to get across to people what it is we're really talking about doing and why the approach that we believe makes sense is going to be a better approach for kids. But I just think we do a really, really horrible job at that in many cases. And then the final thing I think is important is that I don't believe the education reform community has really embraced private school choice as a real valid part of the education reform effort. I think they see vouchers and tax credits as kind of a side project, and it's kind of nice to have. But people who are leading these reform efforts in many states, they hold their nose at the prospect of vouchers or at the prospect of tax credits, and they kind of say, well, we'll allow it. But I think ultimately we have to embrace choice as a real valid three-sector strategy in order to make this work with some traditional public schools, some charter schools, and also some schools in the private sector who are doing a really good job for kids. And I think all those things are incredibly important, but we got to get the reform community there and the community at large there. And so far, I think we're just doing a really poor job of that.
I think that if you look at New Orleans and DC or look at other places where the seeds of reform are being sown, you got to keep in mind that no school district has ever reformed itself from within. They never have, they never will. They only reform through external pressure. And my view is that the best form of external pressure is through parental choice. When you can excite the possibilities for parents, and we've seen it in just taking we've taken legislators, Ken and I have been involved in this, hosting legislators from down south who are considering a charter school bill or a tax credit bill and taking them to a charter school or a private school that has receives opportunity scholarship kids in DC or in Florida. And when these folks can really see what the possibilities are in education, because if you're trapped in a failing school, or if most of your neighbors kids are in bad schools, you don't know what you don't know. And to be able to excite those possibilities is very powerful. And that's why I think that choice is important, because, and that's why the status quo doesn't want choice, because they know that just by that one-size-fits-all model, that they really are able to maintain this monopoly without any interference. But the other point Ken made is so important. And I think that, you know, I've heard Michelle Reese talked about this, and I know the mayor understands this, that one of the things that they probably could have done better was engage that bottom-up strategy. See, I think, and I did this early on, we think that just the rightness of where we are should be enough. But as you see in New Orleans and in DC, you can have test scores that blow it away and people are still gonna fight you. And they come with all this other stuff, you know, cultural sanctity and all this, and you know, you all outsiders coming in. It doesn't matter about the academics. So, you know, one thing Ken said is so important. We have been so top down in the ed reform movement. And even our language can be insulting to the people we want to help. And we have to be very sensitive about making sure we engage the quote-unquote end user and we meet them where they are. And that's what the other side has done brilliantly. You know, I was, you know, helped drive a focus group in Chicago and some polling. And people of all demographics generally supported Rahm Emanuel's vision of change. But they supported Karen Lewis at the same level, the head of the Chicago's teachers union, because she was able to play on those sentimentalities that people in the community could relate to. And what we do in the ed reform movement, we will blast the Karen Lewises, or we will blast the union leader, or we'll knock these folks, these community icons who have grounding in the community. It happened in New Orleans, say, well, they aren't doing what's best for kids. And I think if we want to really change the dynamics in urban education in America, then we need to take a different approach. You know, let those crazy folks say and do their thing, but let's lift up the possibilities and show folks what they can get and what is possible out there, and lift up these examples of success. Because I tell you, every time we take legislators or parents to some of these schools that work, that they didn't even dream was possible, it plants a seed of change that they eventually embrace. So I think that that's something that we really have to look at, because we lose a lot of the PR war because of our indelicate language and the fact that the other side is able to brilliantly use their credibility points by being more grounded in the community than we are.
I got a couple of quick comments here, and I'm going to first disagree with Mayor Fenty on one thing. I don't think the Democrats have it all wrong all the time. I look at some of my Republican colleagues, and I come from the reddest of red states, and I look at them and say, have you lost your mind? Many times. I got an hour-long chewing out by a Republican House member because he decided that he wanted me to take my agency's direction, and we needed more nail technicians coming out of our high schools because his wife and her friends could not find a good nail technician. So we needed more nail techs. And I looked at him and said, have you lost your mind? So, you know, when you get to the area of reform, and whether it's charters or choice, I'm going to offer a cautionary tale. Quality control, as you expand market share, is more important than expanding market share. And I'm the guy who lifted the cap on our high-performing charter schools in the state of Texas and said, if you're a KIPP, a yes, you're exemplary or recognized, our two highest ratings. You don't have to come back to the bureaucracy and ask me for permission to expand. Because I knew Mike Feinberg and Chris Barbick, and I knew their business model, and I knew they'd come from Teach for America that valued the recruitment process and identifying those really high-quality individuals, and I trusted them to expand their market. But I look at other situations where market share has increased and quality has eroded, and I see real problems. You can look at yesterday's New York Times and look at the stories about the Supplemental Education Services Program, the tutoring program from No Child Left Behind, that was pilloried around the country because of the quality of providers. And the premise was sound. Children on the east side of Austin are wealthy enough that their parents, or not wealthy enough that their parents can't afford tutoring. Children on the west side of Austin, where my kids went to school, I could afford to send my kids to Kaplan or Sylvan if I had to. And the premise was sound, that the children on the east side deserve the same opportunity as the children on the west side. But what in practice happened is you had providers who were not qualified to do the work, and you had fraud, and you had massive amounts of fraud. And I've been a proponent of charter schools for many years, but I've closed charters. And here's another issue, big issue for charter schools, and this has percolated around recently in Texas. Charter schools are public schools. Would you agree? When the people accused of defrauding the state go to court and they claim, oh, no, my 501c3 is a private entity. These are not public dollars once they get to me. That's going to be a problem if that proliferates to charters in the future, because it'll erode public trust that the public dollars are being used for a public purpose.
I want to follow up question here, because I'm interested in, Ken, in your statement that we're doing a poor job of messaging, right? That not just that the tenor of sort of what we're saying is wrong, but I wonder if anybody could speak to what then should, if we're going to engage the parents and community members that we want to, what then should the succinct and specific message be? And I don't know, Jeff, too, if you might want to follow up with what you're trying to say to the parents and the community of Lawrence about what's going on in schools.
You want to start?
Sure. So, you know, we have a bit of a different system. We have choice at the high school level, but no choice. We have neighborhood schools. And as a longtime veteran of the Boston Public Schools, to have neighborhood schools where there's virtually no busing can be a incredibly beneficial thing. My issue around choice, and I have mixed feelings about it, is that I know in Boston, for instance, if a school was deemed to be underperforming by law, the school district had to send a letter out to parents saying you have the right to switch schools. And you know, let's say in a district of 56,000 kids, 30,000 kids got this letter. And I remember one year, I think there were 9 parents that took the district up on this idea that they were going to switch schools. And so the communication issue is huge, because if parents don't know that their school is underperforming, that's a problem. Even if they get the letter and they can't see the alternative, that's a real problem. For me, and perhaps, you know, I'm a little bit like Don Quixote tilting at windmills here, I still believe that all my schools in Lawrence should be good, and that parents shouldn't have to even make that choice. That my kids should just be like the same kids a mile away in Andover who go to an Andover school, and any school they go to in Andover is a high quality level 1 school. And so that's what we're trying to do. I recognize that we do need to provide some more choice in the upper grades with AP and honors classes and other things like that. But I still cling to this idea of public education where every school should be great. And so, you know, when you get down the choice process, it's got to come down to messaging, and parents need to be, you know, informed and really truly understand if they have a choice. You know, frankly, I was a public school principal. Many of my parents worked 2 and 3 jobs. They didn't have the time or the wherewithal or sometimes the language capacity to get to a lottery. And we had huge numbers of special education students in my school, specific populations that some charter schools didn't have the programming for. This is, again, personal to me. I have a daughter with special needs in a special program that I couldn't, you know, I don't think they'd have that program in a charter school. So I've kind of come at it from a different perspective. But if you're going to go down this route of choice, it's got to be done really well. And it all comes down to execution. And the execution is informing parents.
I think there are 2 very important things that we need to do, and I think it is a 2-stage problem, right? The first one is, I think we have to change our approach, and we have to have a greater understanding of what the opposition really is, right? There are some people who fight us just on, they don't believe anything that we believe. We have to separate those out, I think, from the people who express legitimate concerns that come out of either their own economic well-being or a community power base. You know, the school system, especially in the black community, in many cases, has been our sole base of power in this country. And so when you start talking about coming in and making very radical change, there are people who express concerns who aren't necessarily saying no. They may be saying, okay, what's my place in this going to be? And that's especially important in places like New Orleans where, you know, for good or for ill, the reputation is, well, you know, there are all these young white, you know, kids from Ivy Leagues who are coming in and they're getting a ton of money to run schools. It's a big, big issue. And so we have to find ways, one, to ensure those people understand where we're going, that they have legitimate opportunities to help lead, shape, and participate in the reform. And if we're able to do that, I believe we're able to move a lot of that opposition out of the way. You know, that's just really people who are concerned. And so I do think there's an approach piece that has to be well thought out. And then the second piece, I think, is really kind of a technical piece on what we say and how they're able to spin it. The reality is that, you know, unions and some of the opposition, they spent a lot of money on understanding what buzzwords are going to mean for people. And they're able to take significant strengths of ours and almost turn them into weaknesses in some amazing ways. And I'll give you 3 really quick examples. The first one is, you know, in charter schools, we always talk about all the kids on the waiting list and how great this is. They're able to turn that into a negative because in their mind, what they're able to point out is this creates winners and losers. And in America, people don't want a system that has winners and losers. They want all kids to be able to do well. And so something that really should be a positive, the fact that parents want more choice, that these schools are doing a really great job, they've been able to take and turn into a criticism. The second one is that we often talk about either teachers' unions being obstructionists or poorly performing teachers. They're easily wrapped that into this reform is anti-teacher, which again, I think is just absolutely crazy, but we allow it to happen because we're not more thoughtful. And then the final one, I think charter schools, in my mind, one of the reasons they should be embraced is because they're one of the most educator-centric reform efforts that we've ever had. I mean, it really is based on educators creating great schools for kids. That really is what it's all about. But we've allowed them to wrap that into, you know, the kind of privatization flag and anti-public school flag. And I think we just have to do a much better job on a bunch of key, you know, marketing and messaging pieces if we're going to be able to have the type of success that we want to have to get our point across, I think, more clearly, because they are very clear and they're tapping into nostalgia, neighborhoods, parents, kids, and we're just having a completely different conversation.
Thank you. You know, I'd also like to, maybe Robert, you would like to comment to this because you noted that you've closed several charter schools. Even if we're not apparently even getting the message right here in Massachusetts, where we have some of not only the highest performing charter schools in the country, but just highest performing schools in the country that happen to be charters, right? Nationally, that's not true if you look at the record. So why is it, do you think, that we don't have more consistency nationwide with regard to what charters look like and are able to do? And to tie into the last comments, what do we do about that in terms of messaging if we want to grow school choice?
Well, I think that some of it starts with the vetting process and the distribution process for charters, whether it's done by a state board of education, whether it's done by a commissioner, whether it's done by a university. There are multiple chartering entities around the country. So you have an inconsistency of who grants, so you have an inconsistency of intake as far as charters go. So that's going to lead to some inconsistency, unless you start to, you know, make that process much more similar regardless of who the entity that grants the charter is. You're right, I've actually closed several charters. In Texas, the Commissioner of Education has considerable power. I could fire a school board. I could fire an elected school board, and I did it. I've closed entire school districts. I closed them and annexed them to another district. And, you know, try being the white guy who is closing the school district. The school district itself is essentially the descendant of a plantation. And the people of the school district are the descendants of the slaves on that plantation. And they are running a school district, and they're not serving their children well. And you have to go in there and say, you know, closing a school is hard. You know, it's one of the hardest things a superintendent can do. Closing a school district, the entire identity of a community, the football team, the baseball team, the basketball team, that hurts. So yeah, it is profoundly difficult work, but you have to look at the results. One district up in Dallas, 30-year problem of not serving its kids was closed. And those children are better served today. Another district in Houston closed this last year, annexed to Houston, and I believe those children will be better served. So the original premise of your question is why don't we have more consistent, I think I answered that, but I went a little further and talked about some of the other closures. It's interesting though, because as I was leaving, I started to see some of the problems with the reform models that we had pioneered in Texas and that got turned into the SIG grants, which are the 4 basic reform models. And I told Arnie Duncan when I went to meet with him, they don't work. We've been trying them in Texas for years. And I've actually been a proponent of looking at some other ways. And I'd be happy to try to talk about that a little bit later.
You know, I have a couple of thoughts. There are 2 reasons why there's such an uneven performance of charters. One is, you know, the price of entry. If you look at the states that have the most rigorous charter school laws, where the price of admission is more difficult, the application process is more onerous, then those states generally have higher performing schools. There are a couple of states, and Texas was like this years ago until you all got in there and changed it, where you almost could sign on a paper and start a charter school, and that changed. Mm-hmm. And you see where the application process was less rigorous, you had poorer schools. And the second problem is that a lot of ed reformers, particularly charter school advocates, it's like looking in the mirror, we become the very thing we fight. It's almost like they're so committed to the charter approach that's the new one size fits all. And I was a charter guy, but the beauty of true parental choice is you have a host of options that are available for kids and families in need. And I've had charter people say, and I know Mayor Fenty went through this because he and I were really pushing charters early on, is, you know, when they're threatening when the DC Public Charter School Board is threatening to close a low-performing charter school in DC, or a charter school that had a leader, a founder who was stealing the money or whatever, and, you know, people will come to him and say, well, aren't you going to help us? I say, no, we're not. But I thought you were a charter school guy. No, I'm a kids guy, and you're not doing right by kids. And I think that a lot of charter folks have this built-in arrogance where they will fight against some of these things when we should be fighting to close bad schools. And I think that is a huge problem in the movement. One is, look at the charter school law in each state, and you'll see the unevenness in the law, you see the unevenness in the performance. And then also look at the fact that we almost have this built-in, blind support of some of these schools that should be closed. And I believe that the purity of the charter movement is what gives it its strength in theory, and hopefully in most places in practice. Because what we're saying to the public is, if we don't do the job and do what's right for kids, we'll shut down. Which in effect is sending that message to other public schools as well, that we will shut you down if you don't do the job. And I think that's been the big problem. When we start trying to find defensive ways to keep bad schools open, we're no different than the very thing we say we're fighting.
Yeah, real quick to add to that, I still believe that our biggest challenge is that educationally overall is that the education establishment at some point just completely abdicated its responsibility to make sure every kid was well educated. Because they sat around, they knew their teachers who, you talked about teacher variation. If you're sitting in a school and the bad teachers in the school and you tolerate them, right? So I really do believe the education establishment has a big brunt of responsibility for this. I think the same way those of us who support charter schools and parent choice cannot abdicate our responsibility, right? We have to say there are certain schools that are not working. We need to be very clear about shutting those schools down. Yeah. And we kind of wrap ourselves again in the banner of, well, parent satisfaction and parents are choosing these schools. And in the same breath, if a group of parents came in a poorly performing public school, we're going to look at them and go, well, no, you don't have that right. we need to be very consistent, I think, and not be hypocritical about saying if this is about quality schools, then we need to make it about quality schools, whether it's public, private, charter, whatever you want to call it. And we can't sit around now because we have some choice and say, well, these schools are different. At the end of the day, we have to be about quality, and we have to make sure everybody understands that.
Just real quick, just an amen to both of those comments and an echoing of what Mayor Fenty said earlier. I would get in more trouble from my legislators when I would make a decision, whether it was about a charter school, public school, anything, if I didn't engage them first. Because I know what the outcome would have been. It would have been not the decision that would have been best for kids in many of those cases. So I echo everything. We've got to be able to stand strong, and if it costs everything, it costs everything. And that's, I think, the right attitude.
I think we'd like to open it up for questions now. Right? Who's got the mic? You can start here.
I can speak loudly without a microphone. I'm David Anderson. I'm an old voucher warrior. I believe in parental choice. But I think the thing that may be missing in parental choice is parents don't have good consumer information. Where is the Zaggett's Guide to Schools?
Yeah, I think that's a really good observation. I think we're getting better at that. We still got a long ways to go, but I think we're getting better at that. One of the things that I think is really interesting is Bill Jackson and folks out at Great Schools are taking it to a completely different level, right? Not just the internet that kind of says what do parents feel about this school, but for example, being able to show a third grade student who is reading on grade level, right, and having a video so that any parent can look at it and see and say, if my kid is not reading at this level, they're not on grade level. Because the amount of information out there is vast, and it's very easy we could get parents to get confused, and so we got to find ways to make the information really relevant, right, and the right information for parents, but we have to do a much better job at that, without a doubt.
Good morning. Excuse me. In all due respect to the panel, I heard you say that people say poor children can't learn. I have never heard anybody say that. What I hear them say is poor children are often at a disadvantage because they don't have the enrichment that a lot of other children have. And I'm going to personalize the story. I was in Maryland this weekend, and my third grader, eight-year-old grandson was very excited about two papers he came home with this week. He got a special grade on them. One of them was about government. Well, he has parents that work in government, and he knew answers to questions that third graders don't usually know. He also had a science paper. Well, it was about friction. It turns out that his other grandfather is a scientist and has been teaching him about friction since he was 3 years old. Well, yes, he had an outstanding paper. Now, and this is a kid who's had 3 books read to him every night since he was born. And let's contrast that with the kid whose parents are not educated, who don't speak English. I don't expect those children to be able to do as well as my enriched grandson. But I want to finish that up because I have another son that lives on Capitol Hill. And when it was time for him to go to school, he was one house away from a choice school. Turns out, last minute, there was room, he was on a waiting list, he was admitted to the school, and there was a parent meeting. And I was there the weekend of the parent meeting. My daughter-in-law came back so upset. They had chosen to live in Northeast Washington. They wanted a multicultural environment. When they got to the school that day, the class was almost all white. They said, how could this be in this community? Well, it turned out when class started, there were more black kids in it. But the point was that the black parents hadn't come to school for the initial things that the white parents had come. Now, there's a lot that goes into making a good school and educating a kid. You need to have those other supports. Poverty is so important. If a kid is hungry. If a kid doesn't have a home to come home to, and the parents are stressed, how can that kid learn like my grandson, who's had all those privileges and extras? So I'd like you to comment on the reality of the perniciousness of poverty and the fact that we're not addressing that in this country when we talk about urban schools.
Well, I'm sure Jeffrey can speak to that, but I just tend to disagree. I think that it is possible for kids who come from those backgrounds to learn like your grandkids. I think we got to meet these kids where they are, and the history is replete of all the examples. We don't have to go back to slavery, which speaks for itself. The fact that there were folks able to learn how to read under those conditions speaks for itself. But even go to Mother Hale and the work she did, educate Margaret Collins in Chicago. These what this man is doing, there are too many examples of people who understand the needs of these kids. And we've got to understand that whether it's Appalachia or the Black Belt down south or urban America, this America we have now has the highest number of kids in poverty ever. And we can't wait for Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty Redux to fix that. We got to figure out how to do it now. And you know how we do that? Jason Cameras, who Adrian knows. He was teaching at Sousa High School in Southeast DC that was in my ward. It had one of the lowest outputs, not just in DC, but in the country. And Jason became Teacher of the Year, National Teacher of the Year, because he called our office, and he said, look, you know what? I think I can teach these kids, but they're hungry. Councilman, can you help me get some food here at 7 in the morning? We worked with some folks, got some food there at 7 in the morning. He had a full house at 7 in the morning to have some of the preparatory things these kids needed to be ready to learn during the school day. And all of a sudden, his classroom became an example where the test scores jumped up in literally a year. So my point is, you can't get that through a one-size-fits-all model where we warehouse kids and then we send the signal to them, you all are different. Because this is America. We're going to have people who don't have the benefits of my kids or your grandkids. But the fact that you grow up in poverty doesn't mean you can't close the gap. There are too many examples of people and teachers and change agents doing this every single day. I visit these schools, and I know, Jeffrey, you want to speak to that.
So I guess what I'd say is I grew up in a Marine Corps household. My father remains to this day the only human being I've ever been afraid of. And so I was raised in a very patriotic house where we were told that, you can be or do anything in America, that this is truly a meritocracy. But the reality is, when I got older and grew up a little, is that only actually works if all kids have a quality education. And I'm not here to say that all kids start in the same place. My daughter is behind. She's got some disabilities, she's behind. But we're going to give her a great educational experience. My daughter, who every night when I come home says, Daddy, Daddy, let's play school. Now, Daddy's played a lot of school all day. But she could be completely turned off by the school system. And the fact that she loves school and can imitate the teacher in a variety of ways is an amazing thing. So I'm not saying all kids start in the same place. Many of my kids in Lawrence are second language learners. English is their second language. They're coming to school thousands of words behind other traditional kids in Massachusetts, knowing fewer words than those kids. And so we do have ground to make up, and some of that is made up through extra time. We talk a lot about the achievement gap that's closing the test score difference between minority groups. I would say there's another gap that we don't talk about a lot, and that's the opportunity gap. You talk about your son being politicians or working in government and things like that. The opportunity gap are the high quality enrichment experiences that suburban kids take for granted and their parents give to them on a regular basis. A dosage of reading all the time. They get ballet lessons, they get all this stuff that my kids don't have the same access to all the time. And so we have to close that gap as well, because in Lawrence we've added a ton of arts and enrichment and a longer school day. because I think that we need our kids to be fully developed citizens, and they need to have those same experiences that the kids get a mile away in a very wealthy town. And so if you give all kids the same kind of experiences, I guarantee you that kids that live in poverty can do the same things. I've seen it over and over again. You know, and some of it is coming down to personalizing education. The days of broad brush teaching 25 kids and hoping that some of them learn it, some of them don't, those days are over. We've got to start assessing each individual kid and seeing what they know, what they don't know. I spend a lot of time with our kids on these enrichment experiences because I tell you that there was a kid when I was in Boston as a deputy superintendent, his name's Michael, he was at the Edison, profoundly dyslexic, has never passed an English MCAS test in his life. But when I created this theater program, this district theater program, and we did it at a professional theater, we did Godspell and he played Jesus, he carried the play. When I say he carried it, I don't mean his performance was exquisite, because it was. What I mean is when there's friends who are actors drop lines, he covered it for them. He helped kids with the props and stuff like that. Now, he has a hard time reading, and he's probably always going to have a hard time reading, but he has an amazing skill. There was a critic there that we had invited from New York who did a lot of work writing about Broadway, and who said to me after the show that if that kid keeps up at this, he could be on Broadway in 10 years. This is a kid that's never going to pass a test, but has amazing abilities and skills that don't show up on the state MCAS test, but are hugely important. To get up in front of 1,000 people and sing and lead a play and then cover your mistakes of your friends, this kid's going to be successful. So that opportunity gap is just as important as the test score achievement gap.
My comment in no way is intended to belittle the challenge that we face in improving schools that are not functioning. My one regret as a superintendent of schools in 3 districts in Massachusetts is that I never worked in an urban environment. They were always school districts that valued education with parents that supported schools.
It's never too late.
Oh, I don't know about that, but thank you. So my comment is the following. Even in the best school districts, the ones that I was lucky enough to work with, it is incredibly difficult to make them better. There is no such thing as a perfect school district, a perfect school that meets the needs of all of its children and all of its parents and all of its educators. So you examine the school and you say, well, you could do better in these areas. Trying to achieve that upward movement is almost impossible. It's not the same challenge as trying to close the achievement gap between a poor school and a good school, but it's certainly a challenge. So I've often thought, in my idealistic way, that wouldn't it be wonderful if we could pair schools or pair school districts so that they could help each other, so that a poor school district could benefit from, and I'm going to use the word advisedly, a rich school district, and a rich school district could learn from the challenges that are faced and then overcome in a poor school district. I don't know if it's so idealistic it will never happen, but it seems to me that could be one of the strategies in our arsenal to try to change and improve education.
You want to take that, or?
Go ahead.
We did a little bit of that in Texas. We did it financially with our Robin Hood school finance system, where we take money from property wealthy districts and we give it to property poor districts. We've not done the reciprocal in terms of exchanging educational reform, but I would point out that if you go to the Rio Grande Valley in Texas, you can see some of the finest innovative education reform models in the country. In Far San Juan Alamo ISD, you're talking STEM schools, early college high schools where the students are graduating with 60 hours of college credit. The IDEA charter school system in the state of Texas is wonderful. There's a school in Donna, Texas, you can literally throw a rock at the border with Mexico. And I went down there, they have 100% college graduate going rate, and I was talking to 3 young students, all children of migrant farm workers with full ride scholarships. So we are learning, maybe we're not pairing them individually, but we're learning a lot from one another.
You know what I think about is the process to get to the signing of the MOU between the districts. That's what I think about, because it would be an arduous process. I think it makes a lot of sense. But the other thing, if you remember Malcolm Gladwell's book Outliers, I mean, the way you close these gaps, I think, is through more time on task. And one of the challenges with school districts, most school districts, is that there are limits to the time that you can spend. And I think to bring low-income kids in poverty up, they need more time on task, longer school days, longer school years. And because of union rules, you can't do it. To do what you're talking about, it would have to be creative, so that there would have to be some more flexibility. And next to having that quality teacher, the longer days, the more hours is the biggest thing to make sure that you can close these gaps. And the sad thing is, 30 years ago when A Nation at Risk came out, that was one of their 38 recommendations, that we need to have longer school days, longer school years, and we've done nothing about it. They also talked about professionalizing teachers. We've done nothing about it. In fact, in 30 years since the recommendations that came out from A Nation at Risk, most of the 38 recommendations have not been adopted. And that, to me, speaks to the fact that we have not prioritized this issue in a practical way that would lead to sustainable success among challenged kids, and also kids, because one of the recommendations they also talked about was more AP and all these kind of things. And 5 years ago, at the 25th anniversary of the Nation at Risk, Strong American Schools, nonpartisan group, said that the main reason why we haven't done that is because of the politics. And the politics is the biggest barrier to wholesale change in implementing those recommendations that will help schools. So I think that makes a lot of sense, but I also think that we really have to push the political envelope a lot more to get some of these things done.
Thank you. I come from Wareham, which is one of the poorer performing school districts within the state. And one of the metrics that I found interesting, is if you look at what we are all familiar with, at least to some extent, and that's the MCAS tests. The MCAS tests and the results are broken down, as you might expect, by school district or by grades, 4th, 8th, 9th grade, whatever. It's also broken down by ethnicity. And to me, there's a very interesting tale, a story. It's not statistical, because one of the groups doesn't have enough participants to be statistically relevant, I don't think. You have white, you have black, you have Hispanic, and then you have Asian. And what I found particularly interesting with regard to Asian, and I'm going to make the point here in just a moment in terms of parenting, is that the Asian kids not only performed better in the MCAS tests than all the other subgroups, the other groups, they improved every year, whereas the other groups were either steady or went down. And the only variable that I can arrive at when I looked at the results, if you will, is the parenting. And one way or the other, you've touched on it here. And it seems to me that it's very true. You don't know what you don't know. In this room, everybody does know. Just by definition, we're here. But outside these four walls, most people don't know. And somehow or other, the message has to get out to them. And maybe the way to do it is to make you, look, the parents in the Asian homes and in the Hispanic homes, black homes, white homes, they don't have the time to be bussed out to Weston, to use it as an example, or to Wellesley, or to Newton. That would be very desirable, perhaps, to go and see a class that has cultural content and context. So we have to, it seems to me, as a suggestion, we have to take the message in some form to them. Maybe we send a film crew in. I'm talking about Hollywood. Somebody to go in and take a movie, a video, a short video of what goes on in Weston, what goes on in Wellesley, what goes on in Newton, and send that home with the kids so that the parent can see it themselves. Because you have to sell it. There has to be, again, in my humble opinion, a Zaggett's type approach. But the message has to come in some way to that parent or those parents, or nothing is going to really happen. Because that's the large group. Again, in here we know. Most of them out there don't know. So It's my comment, it's also my question. What would you do in respect to, first of all, whether you agree or not, but secondly, what would you do in terms of reaching that large disparate group? Thank you.
Jim, do
So
you
I'm
want-
not sure the parents in Newton and Wellesley and Belmont are always the archetypes that we're looking for. I guess what's coming through my mind, and maybe I should think about this before I say it, but
Just gotta say it.
I think what I've seen from many immigrant groups that come into America, whether they're Asian or Latino or African from various islands that used to come to my school in Boston, is there's an appreciation and a work ethic that we as Americans, whether we're black, white, or whatever, have lost. I think that in many ways we've become ugly Americans and a little bit lazy. And I think it's more about us as a country getting back to work and changing our mindset. For those of you who are interested, I would recommend reading Carol Dweck's work on mindset, which is the idea that hard work matters. And it's the hard work, not the actual destination, that's important. And I think what we saw and why this country was built was by immigrant groups that came in that were so appreciative of everything that they have. And I think we've become so rich and so well off that we've lost some of that spark. And I think we need to get that back. And I think that spark is in the city of Boston in places and in some places in Newton. And I think it's gone out in places in Boston and in Wellesley in some places. So I think as a country we need to kind of reassess where we are, that we've become in some ways fat, dumb, and happy, and we need to get back to work.
And I think there's another side to that also that we really have to acknowledge and understand. A lot of parents are acting based on their own belief system about school, based on their experience. And if you are a single mom who dropped out of school and the education system didn't work for you, why would you believe it's going to be any different for your child, who's probably going to the same school that you went to? Right? I mean, so you got to understand, it's not as if those people don't want the best for their kid. They just don't believe this institution is going to give it to them. Right? And it's very important that we understand that. The second thing I think we have to do is we have to change the expectation for parents. My son goes to an A-rated high school. He went to an A-rated middle school. And last year when he came home with homework and scatter plots, despite my wife and I both having advanced degrees, going to the highest levels of math, I had no idea what the hell he was doing. None. And so I'm sitting here on Khan Academy trying to figure out, and you know what? Fortunately, I had the resources to send him to Mathnasium twice a week so they could help him get an A in math because of that. And if our system is based on parents having to do that, we have no chance. No chance whatsoever. So on some level, we have to really think about the role of the teacher, the role of the parent, what it is we're asking parents to be able to do, because I can guarantee you that more than half of the kids who went home with scatter plots, parents had no idea how to help them in homework. And that's just the reality.
Thank you for that. I think we're going to thank you to the panel.
Thank you very much, everyone, for attending. Just a couple of very brief remarks at the end. One is there was one point made about charter schools and their performance around the country, and I think one thing that we should keep sight of is the fact that if you look at the Credo reports over the last 5 years or so, the overall performance of charters has gone up rather rapidly, and a lot of that is getting to the point that you were making, Robert, which is that the closure process, the authorization processes have gotten a lot better. I think we have to continue on that path. Second thing is just a quick point on something that Tom Palmer asked you, Mayor, which is what would you have done differently? I think it's something that goes to what Ken does every day, what Pioneer does, what Kevin does, and many of the other organizations out there that are pro-reform, and that is we need to be out there making the case all the time so someone like yourself doesn't get stuck in a place you have to explain it all yourself. This has to be something that people understand. Final thing. Thank you very much to Seal Hicks, Al Houston for being here from our board. On November 4th, for those of you who are members, Neil Ferguson is going to be speaking on the ascent of money and what's happened to our financial markets. It'll be a great event at the Four Seasons. Please attend if you can. Thank you very much. If you'd like to make your way to the